Hello everyone, and welcome to the 18th Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can control multiple windows in our Cocoa applications. So basically so far we've been working with this single window implementation with a single controller class, and they talk back and forth to each other on what they're displaying, etc. So what we want to figure out though now is how we can have more than one window. So an example of this is when we're in Xcode right here and we go to preferences, and you can see we have all these other things up here, and we can also see other things in the window option as well. If we hit welcome to Xcode, we get a new window showing all the welcome stuff that we see. So anyway, as you can see, there's many times that you'd want to have this multiple window implementation of an application. You might not always want it. Maybe for a game you only want to have one window or something like that. But anyway, the point is, in some cases you want to have more than one window. Another example is in Safari. If you're looking in the Windows section, you have downloads and activity, and that's just another case where you'd have, again, more than one window. Or even in a CAD or like an Adobe Photoshop application, you'd have multiple palettes that you could work off of. So anyway, we're just going to briefly talk first off here on how we should probably organize this new window that we want to create. And this kind of all stems back to the MVC design pattern or model view controller that we were talking about before in the NS table view tutorials. So I didn't talk about it too extensively, but basically the rundown is that we have the model, we have the controller, and then we have the view. And the model is good for all of the data that we want to save for that window. Then that communicates to the controller, and then the controller communicates that to the view, which is our window and all the components on it. And then the view talks back to the controller and then to the model, etc. So that's basically how the flow of data works with that. But we've kind of cut off the model portion for the most part because we haven't really used saving data or data in most of these applications. So we're concerned more with the controller and the view. But the nice thing about the MVC design pattern is that it's very easy to scale it. So if we want to have another window, all we have to do is create a separate controller and a separate window so that we can communicate those two together. And so what we end up with is basically two MVCs, one for this window and this controller, and then another with its own controller and window. So anyway, you get the idea. But it's a lot nicer than throwing everything into, say, one controller class and then having multiple windows for that. So anyway, that's basically what we're trying to set up here. A separate controller and a separate window altogether, and that's how we're going to control it. So first off, we want to have a new window menu option so that we can click it and we can, display this new window. So we just type in menu to our search box and we'll add a new menu item. And we'll just call this one downloads. Then we can also add a new separator like we see in Safari if we want, that separates the windows like so. So now that we have that, we can leave that for later, but now we want to focus on creating that new window and the new controlling class. So what we can do is go to File, New File, or Command N, and under Mac OS X we can hit User Interface, and we're presented with all these Interface Builder documents. And these are basically just templates that we can use to get started. So if we want to have a new nib file that contains a window, we can just hit the window option right there by hitting Next, and then we'll just call it Downloads, because we're going to be simulating that downloads window in Safari, sort of. So with that, now we have this new nib file that contains a window, and for most part, anytime you want to create your own new nib file, you can just do it like that, and you can put a view or a window or whatever you want to contain in the nib file. And we'll be coming back to different ways of using nib files later, but this is what we're doing right now. So of course, now the next part is to just throw on a label for this window, and that's just going to differentiate it from the other ones, just so that you know that this is indeed the window from this nib file. And we'll just call it downloads. So now that we have that, we can now create the controller class that I was talking about a little bit before there. And we have to be specific though on what controller class we're going to use. And when we're using a controller for a window, Apple gives us a nice implementation, or a nice class to use, which is called the NS Window Controller class. And basically, NS Window Controller is used to control a single window, and then you can, say show window, and it will display the window that it's connected to. So it's really nice to subclass, and then we can use that to, add new IB actions or outlets as we please. So we're going to subclass, instead of using NS object, we're going to subclass the NS window controller that Apple gives us, because again, it's obviously used for controlling windows. So we can now use Command N, and that'll just bring up the new files window, file, new file. And what we want to do is go back into the Cocoa section under Mac OS X and hit Objective-C class. And this time we want to subclass NS Window Controller. And once we've done that, we can now hit Next, and we'll just call it Downloads Controller. And then we can hit Save, and now we have that new Downloads Controller class in our navigation bar. So what can we do with this new class and new nib file? Well, we're just going to briefly run through what the NS Window Controller gives us. So NS Window Controller, we're subclassing that, we're calling it Downloads Controller, and you'll see that it gives us a nice little template of what we can add to this. So you can see that it has init with window, which is actually where all our initialization code goes, as you can see right here. So if we wanted to initialize a label or something before the window appeared, we could put it right in there. We could also use window did load, which is something we can use after the window has been loaded. So as the method would, kind of tell you, I guess, through the name, window did load, it implies that it did load. So basically this can be used for things that you don't want to throw into your initializer, like something that would take longer to set up. If you had to do some kind of graphic thing or something, you probably want to put it into window did load. Something that takes a long time to initialize, you don't want to put in it with window, because it does take a long time to initialize, and therefore it will take a long time for your window to actually show up. Because remember, all the initialization work has to be done before the window ever appears. So just keep that in mind when you're working with the NS Window Controller class. Now, with that, we can leave all this stuff alone, because we're not putting anything into this subclass of NS Window Controller, so we can just leave it as so. And all we want to do now is actually set the downloads controller to be the controller or the file's owner of this nib file. And file's owner is sometimes a thing that people really get confused on, but really it just means the class that basically owns or controls the nib file. So in this case, we want the downloads controller to be the owner or the thing that controls most of our applications. So to do that, we can just go into our identity inspector once we click on file's owner, and we can set it to be downloads controller. And once we have that, it knows that it's a subclass of NS Window Controller. And what we are allowed to do now is use what the NS Window Controller class gives us. So there's actually an outlet which is called window, and as you might guess, that's to connect the window that you have right here in your document. So you can connect it like that. And now basically what that means is that any time you call show window, which is obvious, it's going to display the window. If you have your window connected like that, then it can just show the window that it's connected to. So this is a very nice setup. Again, that's why we use the NS Window Controller class, because it gives us this nice setup for the window variable, and then we have all the methods that go along with that. So once we're done with this, we can now hide this if we want, and we can now figure out how we're going to display this window in our menu bar, or when we click it in our menu bar. So again, we want to be able to do this when we click our downloads menu bar item right there. So to do this, we're going to need an IB action, and we're going to be needing the controller class, our downloads controller. So to do this, we can say @class, and that just says, hey compiler, we're going to be using a class called, and we're going to be calling it downloads controller. And that just means you're not importing the file yet because you don't need it right now, but it's just going to say, yeah, I mean we have this class and don't worry about it. So downloads controller, we're just going to call it downloads controller, be pretty original here. And now, of course, like I said, we need that IB action so that we can connect our menu bar item in Interface Builder to this action. So we're just going to call this show downloads. And of course, like all IB actions, we need our sender parameter as well. So now let's flip over to our implementation of this. And of course, we need to implement that IB action. And it's just called show downloads, like that. So what this means now is that we have to set up that controller class so that when we set it up, it's now the file's owner of that downloads nib, and that we can display the window that we want. So you might be thinking, well, why don't we just initialize that controller class right in our initialization where we usually do it? And the thing about this is we might never actually use this window. So you don't want to get, initialization happy and throw everything into your init method. If you don't, or you might not use it, you might not use it. So we want to have a way that we can create the object without actually, not requiring it to alloc init itself. So what we can do is we can use something called lazy instantiation, which is basically just a technique for initializing stuff if it doesn't exist. So we can say if there is no downloads controller, or basically if it's nil, it hasn't been created yet, then, well, we'll create it. So downloads controller, and of course if we're going to use any of the methods in that class, we need to import it. So we'll just say import downloads controller.h, and now we'll just say downloads controller, oops, I screwed that up, too many L's, alloc, and now of course we need to init it. And this is where it's a little different than other things we've worked with. The method that we're going to use is init with window nib name. And what this does is just takes an NS string as parameters, and it just asks for the name of your nib file, which was downloads.nib. So once you give it the name downloads, it will now know that that's what the nib file is going to fetch, and now it's going to be applied to our downloads controller. But the thing that's interesting about this method is that init with window nib name will return, or it will make the receiver, our downloads controller, it will make it the file's owner of that nib file. So even if we didn't set it up in our interface builder, which we did just because we wanted to connect our window in there, so what we do anyway is that we can say we're going to initialize it with the window nib name downloads, and that's all we have to do. And now the downloads controller now becomes the file's owner of that nib file. So like I said before, it doesn't really matter, it's just basically the controlling class of that entire nib file, and basically along with that would be the window. So what we want to do now is we want to say downloads controller, since like the whole point of this method is to show the window, we can call show window. And this is actually an IB action, so it actually takes the ID sender parameter, which is the next part. And since we don't really care where it's being sent from, we could say nil or we could say self. And we'll just say self. It really doesn't matter. You can try both of them and you'll see it works the same way. So anyway, that's that. Now we have our lazy instantiation right there, and we're displaying the window once it's created. And if it's already created, it won't recreate it again. It'll just show the window. So that's what our show downloads will look like. And now, of course, we just have to connect these. So we can go into our main menu nib file, connect our app controller show downloads to the downloads menu bar option. And now that we have that, we can simply run the application. So let's go ahead and run her, and you'll see it compiles the two nib files, runs, and now here we have our one window right here. And now when we go to click the downloads, it'll show up that new window, and there we go. There's our new window that says downloads that we took outside of that nib file. So we can also, you'll see that we can reorganize this in any way that we want, and we could, set whatever we want in the nib file. But we'll also see that if we close it and we open it again, like so, you'll see that it remains in the same spot, and that's because our controller class is staying around for the entire time that as soon as we open it, so it remembers where the window was last located. So anyway, that's basically all you really have to know for creating a new window in in Xcode or in Cocoa. So basically, just to recap what we did, we had our NS window controller class that controls the downloads nib. We have to connect the window outlet of our NS window controller subclass so that when we hit show window, it's actually going to display the window. And then all we have to do from there is set it up in our app controller so that when we click that button, we create a new controller if we need it, and we display the window. So it's pretty simple. There's really not much to this, but you just have to remember that in Cocoa we really try to separate these different elements. We don't try to stick them all into the same class that will control multiple things. We really want to separate a controller to one window or a controller to one view to be specific. So that's really all you have to know about, well, not everything, but some things you have to know about NS Window Controller and the likes to create new windows in Cocoa. Anyways, if you have any questions, please leave your questions in the comments below or send me a message on Twitter, Google+, or YouTube. And also, you might be wondering why I'm not using Lion yet, and that's, well, I don't know really why, but anyway, we'll be using that in a later tutorial, and we'll be talking about new things in Lion, like NS Popover and a few other things as well. So anyway, we'll get into that later, and I don't know when I'll transfer over. I have it on another partition, but I haven't made it my main yet. I'm waiting out, I guess. I don't know why, but anyway, we'll probably have some tutorials in Lion there soon enough, and you can pretty much do all the same things in Snow Leopard anyway, so there's no real need to transfer just yet. But anyway, I'll see you next tutorial.